Thanks very much, Tom. I was saying to Tom that I had actually, when I played football, I did a lot of burpees. And I didn't realize that the burpee was actually invented by someone named Burpee. I just thought it was something, I don't know if you know what a burpee is. I won't do them right now. It's where you have to go prone onto the ground and push yourself up with your hands and back onto your feet. And we used to do 20 and 30 at a time. I don't think I could do one now. In any event, I want to say thank you to Tom and also to Tony for the invitation, and congratulations to Nick on his taking over the presidency in the next few months, I guess it is. And we have some great conversations at the table. I know that the speaker normally receives a gift, but I thought I would give a gift to you. I've got my book called The Goal, which is all about short stories about hockey and about the passion for our game, called The Stories of Our National Passion, written with Dave Stubbs, who's a former journalist of the Gazette and is now the National Hockey League historian. And anyway, we've got pretty good reviews. It's sold about 3,000 copies, but so I thought those people among you that might be hockey fans might enjoy it. So, before I begin my talk, I wanted to just tell you a little story about French and English relations that are can be kind of funny sometimes. My permanent residence is in Kamouraska, and so one day a few years ago I was painting my steps, and a group of Europeans, obviously French people, were gathered around the edge of the property, and they had a tour guide that was talking about the houses of the 1800s that are in Kamouraska, there are a number of them, mine included. And so I went over to them and I said, would you like to see the house? And they said, of course, and I took them around and showed them, and we have a basement kitchen and an old wood stove and a dumbwaiter to take the food up to the next floor. And anyway, they were very, very impressed, and at the end of the discussion, one of them said, vous avez un accent anglais? And I said, oh, c'est parce que je suis anglais québécois, I'm an English Quebecer. And they went, oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay. So then I went back to painting my steps, and about 20 minutes later, a couple walked by, and I took them speaking English, and they were admiring the house, and I said, oh, would you like to see the house? And they said, oh, we'd love to. So I took them around and showed them various parts of the house, and I said, geez, I feel like a real tour guide now, because just an hour ago I was doing this, showing the house in French, and now I'm doing this in English. And they were from Burlington, Ontario. Anyway, the woman sort of, as I said that, said very quite kind of breathlessly, oh, but your English is impeccable. So, yeah. Anyway, so this is not my first Rotary Club meeting, because I used to be involved with the Montreal West Garbage Bowl, which was supported by the Rotary, and they did very good work supporting the what was then the Mackay Center. I also, in the field, working with WHO and UNICEF, was involved with the Polio Plus program and actually gave doses of polio vaccine to kids in the field. So I'm very, very aware of that work and how important it is. And my friend Bruce Aylward, who is very much involved with that, really always talked about how the Rotary did such great work. And I met some of the Rotary presidents when I was in the field when we were supporting Polio Plus, and we're hoping at some point it's almost eradicated. It's a battle, but I'm sure that with Rotary's help it's going to happen. So that's a big my congratulations to you for being involved with that. So Westmount, here we are in Westmount. I have very fond memories of Westmount because my grandparents lived over in a red brick duplex over on Olivier Avenue for about 40 years, from 1936 when they moved from Quebec City. My grandfather, Burton Ramsey, worked in the textile industry. And in March of 1945, my parents were married at St. Matthias, just around the corner here. And it was 2 days after my dad came back from the war, been in combat in Sicily and Italy, and served in Britain. And they hadn't seen each other for 5.5 years, and they married 2 days after he got back. So it was quite something. It was quite a love story. And that old red brick duplex was the site of many réveillons and parties for many, many years, and whenever I go by it, I have very fond memories of it. So for me, family connections and personal history are very important, and as the president of the task force, I get to listen to the stories of people everywhere that I go. And before I took on this job, as you've heard, I worked across Canada and around the world. And then in 2020, I chose to move back to Quebec. My family roots here go back all the way to 1640 and the arrival of the Gagnons in Quebec, and even further back with my Indigenous ancestors. My great-grandfather, John Le Mesurier, was the mayor of Quebec City. He went from being a clerk in a store to owning several stores and factories, and then was mayor. They said he was un homme du peuple, and when trouble broke out on the docks of Quebec, he refused to read the Riot Act, which as mayor he was obliged to do. And instead, he went among the crowd, told jokes, and convinced them all to go home. And otherwise, they would all have been arrested. He was fluently bilingual, as were most of my Quebec City ancestors. I now live in the home that his son, William John, purchased in Kamouraska in 1884. My father spent several years as a child in Scotland, and his parents came from Ireland and England. So I'm the descendant of Québécois de souche on one hand, and immigrants. I grew up in NDG in Montreal West, and I spent summers every year in Kamouraska. Learning French was a real struggle, but I graduated nonetheless in June of 1969. That summer, my French improved significantly when I dated une belle Québécoise, Réjeanne Richard, in Kamouraska. The only words in English she could pronounce were, "Oh, Andrew, you're so stupid." I became bilingual reporting on Parliament, the Montreal Canadien Stanley Cups, and the National Assembly. And over a decade, I lived in every part of Canada. I worked in Switzerland, Macedonia, as you've heard, and India. I've held a jar with Ebola in it, slept under malaria nets in Bangladeshi villages, biked the hot streets of Delhi, worked in refugee camps, represented Canada at the UN, wrote speeches for ministers and prime ministers, and met with officials of many governments. Everywhere I went, I was welcomed as a Canadian. And certainly my ability to speak French was a great asset in Switzerland, France, and in Côte d'Ivoire in Africa. My kids went to public school in French in Geneva and then Ottawa, and they speak French fluently. In fact, my son is an engineer here. He's a member of the Ordre des Ingénieurs. So there are 350 million francophones in this world. Half of them speak French as a second language. So that includes me, you, and your neighbors. The reason I tell you that is I encounter people who are surprised to meet Anglophones who speak French. This is one of the findings of a 2024 report from the Official Languages Commission. It also revealed people of both language groups, and this is a quote, people of both language groups get along in Quebec on the personal level. Well, newsflash, they always have. From the time my great-great-grandfather was elected in Quebec, English and French Canadians have fallen in love, worked together, collaborated in politics, and fought side by side in war. My father fought with Paul Touquet, who won the Victoria Cross in Italy. We don't hear enough of these stories of our past, of what we all share. Instead, we hear of how we were the villains of Quebec history. And it was nationalists exploiting language tension and paranoia, and public servants drafting and implementing extreme laws who caused divisions in our society. I am a francophone, francophile, someone who appreciates the French language and culture. I live, work, and play in French in Kamouraska. I've always been an advocate for francophone minorities in Ontario, Alberta, and Newfoundland and Labrador when I've worked in those governments. After nearly winning a seat in the Ontario legislature in 1985, I went to Queen's Park and was directly involved in the drafting and promotion of the French Language Services Act, Bill 8. And who was instrumental in assisting us? Well, it was English Quebecers from Alliance Quebec, who were working in solidarity with Francophone minorities across the country. When we announced the legislation at a conference of Franco-Ontarians in Ottawa, people stood and cheered with tears in their eyes. In my work internationally, I've met many people who wanted to know the political situation here in Canada and in Quebec. A Swiss border guard stopped me on the eve of the 1995 referendum to say he hoped Canada would stay together because it was such a good example to his own country and their 4 official languages. A UNICEF colleague in Northern Macedonia asked me why I wasn't a separatist. Now, you may know Macedonia was part of Yugoslavia prior to becoming a separate country. And so I asked him how many Macedonians had been senior officials in the government of Yugoslavia. Ministers, president, prime minister, head of the army, finance minister in the former Yugoslavia. The answer was none. So I said in Canada, we've had several prime ministers, governors general, heads of the military, finance ministers, and key ministers who came from Quebec. And he said, well, what's the problem then? In September 17, an article, 2017 article appeared in La Presse. Est-ce que le temps est mûr pour le retour des anglophones? Is the time right for the return of anglophones to Quebec? I had just retired from the public service in Ottawa and decided to move back. I was mentioned in that article. And soon after, I moved to a quiet life in Kamouraska. So I don't have to be fighting this fight. I could just as well leave it to others. I could live in a completely unilingual Quebec with no problems. That's my life now. But I don't want to live in a society that is composed of one culture, one language, or one belief, that is governed by the intolerant. The latest example of Bill 84, which seeks to impose a singular culture on people of diverse backgrounds, is just one example. We live in a world of incredible diversity and complexity. It's at our fingertips and all around us. It's a world of constant change. We English Quebecers have embraced that within our own community, within our province, and within our hearts. We seek a society of greater tolerance and understanding because intolerance is unacceptable in any society in 2025. Most of the wars of the 20th century were linked to nationalism, what Einstein called an infantile disease. It is the measles of mankind. The 19th century notion of the nation state is of a country whose ethnicity, language, and territory are the same. Think of France, Italy, Germany, Spain. That's what Quebec nationalists believe. One language for one territory, an ethnocentric nation state. If that parochial mindset were to win the day, I believe Canada would crumble and eventually cease to exist. Canada is a 21st century country, open to the world. Canada, with its flaws, from its very beginnings, has had a history of accommodating people of other races, religions, and of course, languages. We mean it when we say there is strength in diversity. And in survey after survey, Canada is seen as one of the best places in the world to live. I believe it's because of our foundation in duality, going all the way back to the Quebec Act of 1774. There was a time when Quebec embraced that diversity, when the talk was of civic, not ethnocentric nationalism. When I was a journalist in Quebec City, I asked René Lévesque, who is a Québécois? And he responded, someone who pays taxes in Quebec. By comparison, we now have Premier Legault, who says his first priority is the French language, and he's going to build a museum of French Quebec history. Somehow, I doubt my great-great-grandfather will be in that museum, even though he deserves to be. Looking back in history, heads of state and government established at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that the priority of any state was the security of its citizens. This principle of sovereignty has endured over centuries. So according to international convention, the first priority of any head of government has to be the physical health and economic security of its citizens. An overemphasis on a single issue, like language, over health, security, education, and the economy, is an abdication of that responsibility. Last year, the Legault government backed down on directives on health. And while it was a small victory, our rights to health services in English should never have been at risk. And it was thanks to warriors like Eric Maldoff and Aaron Durfel of the Gazette, who fought tirelessly to expose the maliciousness of those directives. But there remain more challenges in our healthcare system. Regulations affecting the workplace could still mean doctors and nurses could be victims of anonymous complaints if they don't speak French right away to patients. And hospitals will be constrained in hiring with stringent rules requiring fluency in French over all other skills. And finally, we hear Quebec leaders brag that in bilingual institutions, the use of another language is permitted in conversations. Permitted in conversations, personal conversations. In what universe does a law permit personal conversations? But that's where we are, and there are more, perhaps more difficult fights to come. We saw this philosophy in the refusal to allow an English book club in a library in the gay village. And I told the media, you might have seen it, that the decision was not a flaw, but a feature of Bill 96. The Premier calls us the best treated minority in the world. Well, he should travel more, because I can name better treated minorities: the Swiss Romand, the Belgians, the Belgian Walloons, Christians in India, Albanians in Macedonia, the Swedes in Finland, and the Okinawans in Japan. And it is a truism that you don't improve the lot of one group by suppressing that of another. Everywhere I've traveled, I learned other languages, and many of the international colleagues that I worked with spoke 3 and 4 languages fluently. Not one of them ever said that learning another language made them less fluent in their mother tongue. And yet that's what Quebec nationalists would have you believe. And they refuse to recognize that English is the language of business and the world. And while I wouldn't want to return to the days when you had to speak English to get ahead in Quebec, there is a huge intellectual and cognitive benefit in being bilingual. The 80 or so percent of Anglo-Quebecers who speak French are proof of that. All that said, there are unilingual Anglophones in Quebec. And who are they? They're the elderly, Indigenous people, visible minorities, rural poor, recent immigrants from English-speaking countries, and physically or mentally challenged. These are people who need government services the most, who are on the margins of society. It's not right to deny them those services as taxpayers and citizens. And then there are the so-called non-historic Anglos. According to Bill 96, 500,000 people can be arbitrarily denied their rights as citizens and taxpayers because of where they were educated. And it's an absurd description of who English Quebecers are, to just say where you spent the majority of your schooling. My late son James was born in Montreal, grew up near Ormstown, moved to the US at 10, and came back to attend Dawson, McGill, and RMC, and served in the military for 12 years, and was a peacekeeper, UN peacekeeper in Bosnia. Were he alive, he would not be considered an historic Anglophone. Gemma Rayburn Baines is a prominent Quebecer who has made enormous contributions to the Black community in Montreal. She came here from Barbados at the age of 14. She is not an historic Anglophone. And as she gets older, she's told me, she's worried that her French is fading, but she could be denied services in English. I belong to the Wednesday night discussion group that was founded here in Westmount by Diana Nicholson and David Nicholson. The people on that group have made huge contributions to academia, business, medicine, and journalism in Quebec. More than half are not historic Anglophones. So there's 500,000 of people like them here in Quebec. Canadian citizens from the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, England, Ireland, and the US who speak English and don't qualify for services in English. How ridiculous, how cruel, how unfair is that? And yet, that's one of the key sections of Bill 96. So that's why I helped found the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. 4 years ago, in June of 2021, we were shocked by 2 egregious pieces of legislation, Bill 96 and Bill C-32 as it was then, the changes to the Official Languages Act. We looked at the political landscape and saw the need for a grassroots-based advocacy group for English-speaking Quebecers. Since the closing of Alliance Quebec, nothing like that existed. There was the English Secretariat in Quebec City, but it had been weaponized by Premier Legault's office with grants tied to silence from community groups. And the QCGN, while becoming more activist, was still a federally funded coordinating body for organizations. We formed a working group to analyze these bills and provided moderate, incisive analysis. We worked diligently and applied to become a nonprofit organization. We brought in people from across Quebec and consulted widely. The task force, in fact, was the first group to warn of the dangers of Bill 96. In an op-ed published in the Gazette in August of 2021, we wrote, "These pieces of legislation threaten the existence of our community, our institutions, and our jobs. Bill 96, shielded by the Canadian Constitution's notwithstanding clause, threatens the rights and freedoms of all Quebecers. We were right then, and we're right now." Since the founding of the task force, we've undertaken dozens of interviews and op-eds in the French and English media, launched a Taking It to Court initiative with the Bergman law firm to mount 2 lawsuits against Bill 96, mobilized thousands of participants for anti-Bill 96 rallies, submitted briefs to the Senate and House of Commons official languages committees, collected dozens of stories of abuses due to Bill 96, collaborated with organizations like the QCGN to complement their work. Our website, www.thetaskforce.ca, provides our mission and vision statement. And our board is composed of prominent members of the community from across Quebec. As a grassroots nonprofit organization, we have the latitude to say and do as we like. When we speak forcefully. We're not afraid to criticize any government or call them to account. But we believe the way in creating a better society is through dialogue, sharing, and protection of the rights of all. It's not through the imposition of discriminatory laws that reduce access to government services, diminish rights, or create barriers between people. It's why I'm the lead plaintiff in the case involving challenging Bill 96 in court. While there are several cases challenging the law, ours is unique in that it involves several individuals who are detrimentally affected by the law. We're also challenging Quebec's attempt to change the Constitution to recognize Quebec as a French-speaking nation. We've been forced to defend the Constitution, and as such, we've served both the Attorney General of Quebec and the Attorney General of Canada. Ironically, our case was slowed down by the recent demand for a hearing by the Attorney General of Canada, who refuses to acknowledge his duty and obligation to defend the Constitution. Now, these legal cases cost money, and we've raised over $160,000 for those cases, much of it in small donations from people like you. So we need your help. There's my pitch. Furthermore, English-speaking Quebecers compose the largest bilingual community in this country. And English is an asset. You'd have to be willfully blind not to recognize English as the international language of business, of diplomacy, and travel. English-speaking Quebecers are an enormous asset to Quebec, not a threat. We choose to live here, work here, and raise our families here, and encourage the growth of the French language among us. But we will never accept being discriminated against for who we are. We seek progress in Quebec in a spirit of respect, acceptance, collaboration, and love. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote a famous poem, which was, "Love consists of this, 2 solitudes, meet, protect, and greet each other." So for me, this is not an issue of language, it's a matter of human rights. English-speaking Quebecers are full citizens who pay taxes, build great institutions, and 1.25 million of us pay to maintain them. Every single person who speaks English is part of this historic community. And despite the narrow parochialism of Quebec nationalism, Quebec is one of the best places in the world to live. Our metropolis, Montreal, is one of the great multilingual cities in the world. We have safe neighborhoods, jobs, and as Montrealers, we are part of a dynamic community, one known across the globe. Now, I love my town of Kamouraska, 600 people, for its peace, tranquility, francophone culture, and small town feel. And I love Montreal too for its energy, entrepreneurialism, multilingualism, and big city pace. But I would never want Kamouraska to be another Montreal, and in the same way, I would never accept that Montreal would be a village like Kamouraska. At the task force, we know we must get our message across, and we have to listen to people. So we've applied for federal funding to undertake a campaign across Quebec. This spring, summer, and fall, we plan to travel from Pontiac in the west to Gaspé in the lower North Shore in the east, from Chisasibi in the north, around James Bay, to Huntington near the American border, and parts in between. At each stop, we will gather, listen, and share 5 basic truths about Quebec's English-speaking community. 1, we are one of the most diverse communities in the world, with dozens of nationalities and races who use English as our common language. 2, we are not a threat to Quebec. We are an enormous asset, as we can interpret Quebec to the rest of Canada and the world. 3, we aren't rich. The median income of Francophone Quebecers exceeds that of Anglophone Quebecers. 4, French is not in decline in Quebec. Studies show it's growing as more people of other mother tongues speak French. 5, our institutions are Quebec institutions, and they are open to all Quebecers. I hope that among our audiences will be young people. We need them to stay and to get involved. There will be municipal elections all across Quebec this fall, and the next generations of Quebec's leaders will come from our villages, towns, and cities. We need to encourage young Anglophones and Allophones to put their names forward. I get a great deal of pleasure in being a councillor in Quebec, in Kamouraska, and for the last few years have been very good to me. But it angers me that over and over again, we have to fight the narrow-minded, parochial, disingenuous, and even bigoted politicians in Quebec City who don't represent the majority of Quebecers. Because this is home, and it always has been, for my mother's family with the roots going back to 1640 and beyond, and my father's who came here from Ireland and Scotland. My life has been dedicated to serving my country, to promoting understanding, and to engaging in dialogue. In short, better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. My service to Canada in the past pales into comparison with that of my father in Britain and Italy and my son in Bosnia. However, I believe that I am now serving Canada by fighting for the rights of Canadians here in Quebec. Today, we can only rely on ourselves and our own funds to fight this fight. And we will be speaking for you in court, in the media, in our communities across the province. I've never backed down from a fight, and I know our members won't either. So when we are victorious, we will celebrate. With every small victory, with every change in perception and public opinion, we will share the joy and satisfaction of each triumph. And mark my words, these victories will come. For our time is now, our cause is just, and our spirit will never, ever be broken. Thank you.
Oh.